particular, I want to thank Leo and Sam for making it possible for me to be here. I also want to thank the Canadian people for allowing me to be in a country where I can proclaim myself a socialist and not have fear that I'll wind up on Fox News. Assuming that I'm not going to wind up on Fox News. So, Power's mission is to eradicate poverty and oppression once and for all. And when we wrote that mission statement in 1997, we were very clear the implications that we were talking about then. We were seeing back then an increase in the level of structural unemployment, so that more and more people were forced out of working class industries that previously had allowed them to make ends meet, to raise families, and to be able to thrive in urban communities. More and more people were winding up homeless on the streets. More and more people were winding up without health insurance. But there was silence from the centers of power in our country. More and more poor people were being criminalized and vilified for being poor as a result of capitalist accumulation. We felt like it was critical, absolutely critical, for low-income people, working-class folks, low-income people of color to have a space to be able to weigh in on the public policy decisions that were affecting their lives. We began by organizing workfare workers, but after the San Francisco government was successful in slashing the welfare rolls, we took up 2 new organizing projects that we've been running since 2005. The first organizing project now is organizing immigrant Latinas, folks who work as domestic workers, cleaning the houses, raising kids of the rich professional class in San Francisco. The other organizing project is organizing working class African Americans in the last African American neighborhood in San Francisco in a fight for affordable housing and living wage jobs. Now, I want to paint a picture. Oftentimes, when people hear about San Francisco, they think of it as a progressive utopia. It's, you know, a place where gay people get elected to the board of supervisors, where the general population wants U.S. troops out of Iraq immediately, where we've actually fought to raise the minimum wage 300% higher than the national minimum wage. But at its core, San Francisco is a global city in the midst of U.S. imperialism. The dynamics that working class people and people of color experience on a day-to-day basis are the same experiences of colonized people throughout the global South. For immigrants, and in our case, the immigrant Latinas who are working, driving across city, oftentimes driving across city lines in order to be able to clean people's houses, raise their kids, the San Francisco Police Department has adopted a policy of racial profiling Latinos, stopping folks, and ultimately, if they find people without a driver's license, seizing their car, not allowing people to be able to reclaim their car for at least a week, which means that people have to pay anywhere from between $3,000 to $5,000 in order to get their automobile back. In Bayview Hunters Point, there has been a 60% drop of the African American community over the last 10 years. And there's been complete silence, while houses are being taken away from a community that helped to build San Francisco. In the meantime, the mayoral administration, the corporate elites are concocting plans to reconstruct San Francisco's economy after the collapse of the dot-com economy by replacing it with the biotech industry. By trying to figure out how it is that they can supplement high finance and real estate with biotech to then create an immense professional class. And then knowing that those rich, mostly white folks don't want to clean their houses, cook their meals, or prepare their lattes, they know that they still need a large service sector to do all of that work for them. So San Francisco's economy looks like an hourglass. But it's not just San Francisco's economy. We know that there are fewer and fewer options of the middle classes, of folks having the opportunity to be able to engage productive employment to allow them to meet their basic needs and their families' needs. So Power's been engaged in a fight to be able to not just change the conditions that are happening in San Francisco, but really to begin trying to figure out, well, what does it mean for us to craft a new imagination? What does it mean to begin to reshape the aspirations of the working class so that we begin thinking beyond just making basic day-to-day victories, but how is it that we can actually begin changing the structural systems of oppression that impact our day-to-day lives? Now, over the course of Power's work, we've been able to win some, I think, relatively impressive victories. We were able to force the city and county of San Francisco to provide free public transportation for all workwear workers in San Francisco. We were also able to force the city to create an apprenticeship program that allowed workwear workers to actually move into unionized civil service positions, which they were previously barred from even applying for. We were also able to force the city to begin inspecting public housing units in San Francisco, whereas previously the Department of Housing Inspection said, well, public housing complexes aren't part of our jurisdiction. We don't go out to investigate them. So the fact that there was raw sewage pumping up into people's kitchen sinks, into their bathtubs, they said wasn't our responsibility. Right? It was all a part of deliberate neglect where they were allowing working class communities, but particularly the housing projects, to fall into dilapidation so that ultimately it would be the residents who were calling for the demolition of those properties. All in an attempt to then ultimately raise those properties, displace the people who had previously lived there, offer false promises that they would have the right to return, but then ultimately build luxury condominiums where they had previously raised their families. So Power's work has been impressive. There are other organizations all across the country that I think are engaged in a similar type of struggle and have begun developing new types of organizing models. The challenge is that none of that is enough. Even as good as our work has been, we are not able to turn the tide in the neoliberal project and the U.S. imperialist project that is ultimately displacing us from our homelands, displacing us from our communities, and removing our capacity to be able to live a dignified life. It is critical that we begin to take up that question, and I think in particular, those of us who are engaged in the process of trying to build popular organization, whether it be community organizations or trade unions, it is critical that we take up this question as to what does it mean for us in the long term to have a strategy to win. Now, a lot of people, when they hear about the work that we're doing at Power, and I'm sure that, you know, as other folks are doing on-the-ground base building work, they hear some of the same sort of, you know, platitudes. My mom, it's very honorable work that you're doing. Nice, you know, it's better than what she said 15 years ago. But ultimately, I'm not engaged in this work from a position of charity. I do this work because I'm a revolutionary. I do this work because I believe that the working class is changing. I believe that building popular organization amongst these constituencies is of strategic importance for us to build a revolutionary movement inside the empire and around the globe. And so I think that there are particular challenges that those of us who are engaged in on-the-ground organizing have to take much more seriously. And there are a couple of them that I want to talk about and sort of use some of the experiences and examples of Power's work to draw that out. The first is that I think that we need to really take seriously the question of cadre development. So oftentimes we talk about leadership development. And there are many organizations I know throughout the United States that would refer to leadership development as the process of allowing one of our members to speak at an action, to maybe tell a story, like, you know, how bad is your life experience and why is it necessary to make particular changes? That's not leadership. That's an interesting story. That is potentially pulling on heartstrings, but that is not ultimately leadership. We have to develop the analytic, the strategic, and the tactical capacity of working class people, people of color, in order to lead organizations and to be able to lead movements. And that doesn't come easily. I remember when I was in South Africa, I graduated from university, I'd gone to an elite university, and I still didn't like reading theory. I was just, it's just hard, and ultimately it needs to be translated. Somebody should make this easier, right? And I got the chance to go to the Congress of the South African Communist Party. And as they were in the midst of trying to figure out how it is that they were going to reshape their society, they were taking a break after an hour-and-a-half long session, and after folks were done singing and toy-toying, there was a break, and everybody went out to the book stand. So I went out to the book stand, and I was looking at books, and this guy comes walking up behind me, and he says, well, you got to understand that when Marx wrote The Poverty of Philosophy, he was writing in response to Hegel, who was writing about the philosophy of poverty. And I was like, wow, it's deep. So where are you a professor? He's like, no, I'm not a professor, I'm a diamond miner. And I was like, oh, okay, cool, so you used to be a diamond miner, but now you're a professor somewhere, so where do you teach? And he was like, no, I'm a shop steward, and as a part of the struggle, we all sat down and read these classic texts. And we took this seriously because we understood that it was going to shape and inform our ability to be able to lead a successful struggle. I think too often, we don't take the capacity of working class people seriously enough. And I think it is incumbent upon us who are building base popular organizations who have left progressive, socialist, revolutionary politics to take this question of cadre development absolutely seriously. So, and there are ways to do it. I think that, for us at Power, one of the challenges that we've come up against is this question of the tensions between African American and Latino folks in the broader community, but then also within the organization. So when we started the organization in 1997, at the time I didn't speak any Spanish, and so the membership reflected that as the only organizer. Within 2 years, we had hired a Spanish-speaking organizer, and so more and more Spanish-speaking folks were coming into the organization. And very quickly, there was a lot of conflict between the African Americans and the Latinas. A lot of the African Americans said, the meetings here were boring before, and now they're boring times 2 because there's translation. I don't like this. We need to change something. And a lot of the Latinas had problems with, folks in the African Americans particularly sort of not waiting for the translation. Folks didn't feel like there was a legitimate and valid opportunity to be able to speak. And then oftentimes people were saying very derogatory things about the respective communities. And initially, the leadership of the organization and the staff would respond with a line of Rodney King. And we said, well, can't we all just get along? We're all in this together. And what was it didn't hold. It didn't carry anybody's ideas of what was going on in the world. And so ultimately, some of the members were willing to stop saying derogatory things, particularly in front of the staff, because they got sick of having to sit in a 2-hour one-on-one where they were chastised or whatever it is that they said. But it clearly wasn't the level of unity that we wanted to build. So ultimately, the tensions got to a point in the organization where we realized that we had to deal with it. And some of the members were calling for a splitting of the organization, that the organization should split into 2, one for African Americans and one for Latinas. And rather than come down in an authoritarian way, we decided that we would have some discussion about it. So we brought the members who are on the leadership body of the organization together. It was about 30 folks. And we said, okay, there's some serious questions and problems inside the organization. So in order to make this decision, we just want to make sure that we make the decision having thought about it very deliberately. So we're going to spend 10 weeks talking about what's going on in the organization, where it is that we all come from, and at the end of it, we're going to make a decision. And if the members decide to split, we're going to split. But we began this 10-week series where we met once a week, and all of the members were required to come every session. We started off by just asking people, well, what are the problems that you see in your community? And what was interesting was that a lot of the African Americans talked about the high level of unemployment. In Bayview Hunters Point, the unofficial level of unemployment is probably close to 50 or 60%. Folks were clear that they didn't have jobs. Their explanation for that was that Latinos had come to the United States and were taking their jobs. We talked about the problems that the Latinas were facing. And they didn't really have problems of unemployment, but they really talked about problems of underemployment, where folks were trying to piece together all of these part-time jobs. Working under the table, cleaning people's houses, doing whatever else, sometimes getting paid, sometimes not getting paid. The problem wasn't that they weren't able to find work, but the problem was that they weren't able to find decent work. And their explanation was, well, we are working arduously to find the jobs that we get. African Americans should be able to do the same thing. They must be lazy. Okay, cool. So, we're not trying to get into the explanations as to why it is that people may or may not have jobs or what the problems are. We just want to list out the problems. So we did that in the first session. The next 4 sessions, we did an experiment of talking about the history of African Americans in the United States, beginning with the transatlantic slave trade. What was deep was a lot of the Latinas had no idea about the history of slavery. They thought that African Americans had come to the United States just like any other immigrant. And that now African Americans spoke English and had papers, so they didn't understand what the big problem was. You could see instantly, as folks began to understand the history of African Americans, not just in the transatlantic slave trade, but then through the Reconstruction and all the way through the Civil Rights Movement, the Latinos' perception of African Americans, the African American experience in the United States, began to transform dramatically. So then, we spent 4 weeks talking about the history of U.S. intervention in Latin America, where a lot of the African Americans thought, well, we struggled and fought during the civil rights to be able to get many of the jobs that we have now. Now, just after we won, all of these Mexicans, because everybody's Mexican, all of these Mexicans have come to steal our jobs. So then we started talking about the history, the role that the United States had played in undermining liberation movements throughout Latin America, but then also the role that the United States had played in the Bracero program of maintaining a subjugated class of workers in the Latino community. Again, you could see the members' consciousness beginning to shift. So that then when we came to the 10th session, we said, okay, look, we've now gone through 9 weeks of having the opportunity to talk about our respective histories in this country. What are the problems that people see in their communities? And people, again, sort of listed a lot of the same problems. Then we asked people, well, what are some of the root causes of those problems? And people began to talk explicitly about the dynamics of capitalism, imperialism, patriarchy, and white supremacy. And as people began to identify for themselves the root causes of the problems that we were up against, they started to see themselves as allies in a similar struggle. So that then, subsequently, you began to see the shift where no longer was it the staff having to crack down on the members, but the members actually took up a role of really talking about power as a multiracial organization and really trying to push for multiracial alliances all across the city. So a couple examples of that. One of our members, Larry Lattimore, African-American member who was pretty frustrated with the dysfunctional translation system that we had at the beginning. He ultimately became the most ardent language rights advocate in the city. So we'll be in any community meeting. I mean, it's not even a power, sometimes it's inappropriate actually. We'll be in a meeting that's not even a power meeting. And a Spanish-speaking person will come in and Larry will stand up and say, we have to stop because there are experiences in the working class that we need to learn from. And there is no way that we're going to be able to solicit all of those ideas, aspirations, and experiences if we don't hear everybody's voice. So we need to stop until we can find somebody who can translate for this meeting. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that as the women workers took up this campaign against the targeting of Latino drivers by the San Francisco Police Department, they made a conscious decision to frame that campaign as a campaign against racial profiling. Right? Racial profiling, for anybody who speaks Spanish knows, doesn't exist. It doesn't exist as a phrase in Spanish. Folks decided to call the campaign, to invent language, to talk about, translate it directly, to call it a racial profiling campaign. One, so that they internally would understand the connections better between the African American experience and the Latino experience in San Francisco. I thought it was an appropriate thing to do internally, and maybe we'll just sort of leave it at that. The members said no. We're going to talk about this campaign as a campaign against racial profiling externally because people in the community need to understand the dynamics and experiences of African Americans, and we can talk about our experiences as being united and similar in that process of outreaching for our campaigns. Ultimately, I think it is that process of slowly and deliberately trying to reintroduce people to their histories and to some analysis about what's going on that ultimately allows us to develop class consciousness. Cadre is possible to develop. We just have to think about how that happens. Too often, it's my experience, it's not impossible to do. Organizers are scared to put their politics out. And I know that was certainly true for us. When we said, well, can't we all just get along? In part, it was because we didn't feel like it was appropriate to talk about the history of imperialism, white supremacy, colonialism in the United States. We didn't want to alienate or marginalize people. But the fact of the matter is that people are being alienated and marginalized as they walk, as they catch the bus. We're not going to exacerbate a lot of stuff inside of a membership meeting, right? So one, it made sense for us to begin talking about it, but two, it was critical for us to develop our ability to understand and then talk about it. So part of it was our fear of being able to put out left politics. Part of it was our fear that we didn't actually want to sharpen our chops to understand the systems that were actually impacting our lives. What we've seen ultimately in really trying to develop cadre is that people stay a part of the organization in a way that they didn't before. So there was one member who was a part of the organization early on as we were organizing workwear workers, and after the attacks on September 11th, wound up coming back to the organization and said, I'm here because I need to make sense of what's going on in the world. And I don't know any other place that's going to give me the opportunity to talk about that. I think it is critical for us to be thinking seriously about cadre development. One last thing that Power is trying to do right now, as we've gotten more emboldened to talk about our revolutionary politics within the organization, members have said, well, we want to know some of these histories. We sent delegations to Venezuela. Some of our staff people have gone off to the Philippines. Folks have said, look, I want to know these histories too. And so this year we're launching what we're calling the Harriet Tubman Book Club. It's a slight take on Oprah's book club. She hasn't gotten all these books yet, but I'm sure it's coming. And so we're beginning, the first round is looking at the experience of the Russian Revolution. So we're reading John Reed's 10 Days That Shook the World. And folks have a month to read it. And we have circles where everybody winds up meeting over the course of that month and just does comprehension with each other. Make sure that everybody's sort of getting it. And then the next month we wind up getting together to just talk about, well, what happened there? How are those experiences relevant to our struggles in San Francisco? And then in addition to that, we're reading some of the theory that grew out of that particular struggle. So folks are reading Lenin. And it is amazing. It is like pouring water into a dry plant. People are so hungry for this. People are struggling. Literally, people are making like 2 and 3 pages a day. But people are committed to reading this stuff because they want to know how it is that they're going to be able to change the world in the way that they need for it to change. People are willing to take up this work. We just need to create opportunities for people to be able to do that. So first, I think we really need to be thinking seriously about cadre development. That, I think we can do to some extent within base building organizations. But there are some things that we cannot do within base building organizations, as Sam, I think, was alluding to earlier. And that, I think, ultimately sets out the second imperative, which is to really think seriously about building explicitly left socialist organization. So, and I'll talk, if I can, mostly about the United States. My sense of sort of coming and getting involved in this work, even in as much as I had radical tendencies, I was very alienated from the left, because what I knew was that I was in the streets, in housing projects, in the homeless shelters organizing, but there were very few self-proclaimed leftists who were doing that with me. The only time I saw leftists was when we were organizing demonstrations against the mayor or against the welfare department, and people came to try to sell newspapers. So that, to me, wasn't a revolutionary. To me, the real challenge was, well, what does it take for us to build popular power? I think newspapers are very important. They can be a part of that ingredient, but we can't substitute building organization. And so, as I was going through this process, the left just didn't make a lot of sense to me. Now, later on, I wound up joining a left organization called Storm, which we can talk more about if people want. People might have heard about it. It was on Fox News. It was the organization that Van Jones was previously a part of, and then was later part of the witch hunt of him. But for me, being a part of the Storm was critical in my consciousness, and it helped me see particular things. But ultimately, I think my sense of what it means to build the left is about addressing some fundamental weaknesses that exist in the left, particularly in the United States. And I think that that's most centrally that the left is not sufficiently rooted in working class communities and communities of color. We can't convince everybody that the left is a great thing without deeply rooting ourselves in the communities that have the most direct experience, most interest in overturning it. That doesn't come easily, but we have to figure out a way of building relationships with communities that are ready to take on a fight and ready to engage in revolutionary ideas. From my standpoint, there's this writer, Martha Harter, who people probably know a lot about, but in trying to write about the development of the left and some of the successes in Latin America, she poses sort of these two characters, these two social actors. The party left and the social movement left. And she talks about the social movement left as being sort of organizations, networks that are rooted in particular constituencies, but that are led by, they're not organizations where everybody considers themselves a socialist, but they are led by, have influence of organizers, member leaders who are seeing the fundamental weaknesses of capitalism, white supremacy, and patriarchy, and are trying to sort of develop anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist consciousness and leadership in those organizations. To me, particularly in the United States, the formula for building the left centrally rests on the shoulders of people in the social movement left. One of the challenges is that oftentimes we, in the social movement left, don't think of ourselves as leftists. I think it is absolutely critical that we stop waiting on somebody else to build the left, but we actually take up that responsibility ourselves. So, to me, there are particular things that left socialist organization allows us to do that we can't do in a democratic base-building organization. There are probably a lot more, but there are two I want to name. The first is, I think that it allows us to craft a vision of what it is that society will look like. How is that going to materially improve people's lives in a way that's difficult to do within a base-building organization? Sam mentioned the silence of the left in the midst of the economic crisis. The fact that the left, the best that we were able to say was that the government should bail out the people and not the banks. It's true. It's a good thing to say, but that doesn't begin to paint a picture for people about how is it that production is going to be changed. How is it that social life and consumption is going to be changed in our cities and in our communities? what are the new power relations going to look like? None of this was created in anything that the left was putting out, and I think that that was a critical failure. We have to begin putting out a message that goes beyond free commodities, right? Oftentimes socialism is talked about as if it's Christmas, right? You get free education, free housing, free healthcare, everything's free. We have to move beyond the vision of free, where Amilcar Cabral talked about the fundamental crime that imperialism commits on a people is that it removes them from their history. It takes them out of their own independent and autonomous development. We have to talk about the fact that life will be better. You will have some more free stuff. But in fact, life will be better, and we will be able to engage in a process where we use the means of production, where we use mechanisms of technology to actually improve the quality of life, the genuine quality of life for all of humanity and for the planet. We have to be able to craft that vision, and that comes from a socialist left organization. The other thing that a socialist left organization helps us to do, helps us as social movement leftists to do, is define the revolutionary edge of reform work. Too often are we engaged in fights where we're just thinking about benefiting our particular constituency. We don't, even as leftists in fighting mass organizations, don't think about, well, what does this mean for the class? What does this mean for a larger revolutionary strategy? And so then as a consequence, oftentimes organizations which are pitted in their particular silos fight against one another for small marginal resources, because we have no space to be able to come together to think about, well, what is a strategy that goes beyond our particular sectors? What is a strategy that actually begins to unite particular factions of various classes in a fight for the demands that we think are possible at this particular moment in history? The two things, again, that I think are critical for us to be thinking about are developing cadre and ultimately developing organization. And I would say that the critical role, the central responsibility, falls on the shoulders of folks who are building mass organizations right now. And it is imperative then that all of us figure out a way to support the building of those organizations. And I was fortunate to get a chance to meet with comrades, activists in some amazing base-building organizations here in Toronto. The folks from No One Is Illegal, the folks from OCAP. And then also the folks from BATSI. It is critical for us to figure out ways of being able to support those organizations in their development, even if we're not committing our time as organizers, right? Because I think that we are at a critical moment in history. In 2006, I got a chance to go down to the World Social Forum that took place in Venezuela. And Hugo Chavez spoke and said that, you know, for previous generations of revolutionaries, folks got to think in terms of decades, even centuries, about what a winning strategy would look like. And particularly because of the ecological crisis, we're now talking about couples of years, right? A single decade do we have before we pass a particular tipping point where human life won't be sustained on the planet. It's critical for us to be figuring out these questions, and this is the moment. The ruling class ran their economy into a brick wall, and they've been able to paper over some of the weaknesses, but ultimately, those fundamental crises are still there. Unemployment is continuing to rise, foreclosures are continuing to go up, the food crisis is continuing to get more and more acute. The crises are going to continue to happen. The question is, what are we going to do? And I would say that we are in a position to ultimately be able to change the course of history. I remember, last story, I went to Cuba in 1997. And I remember the first time I was there, I got a chance to go to the Museum of the Revolution, which people who've been to Cuba, to Havana, know is in this hacienda, right? And you start there, and it's a little bit like the Guggenheim. So you sort of walk down in this little spiral, and it starts off up at the top depicting Spanish colonialism of Cuba, and then you start seeing the invasion of the United States and just the craziness that went happening then. But then at a particular point, you see Fidel, sort of young Fidel with no beard, law student, and then you continue to sort of wind through the museum, and you see the amazing things that the Cuban Revolution was able to achieve. You see pictures of folks in the literacy campaigns. You see Cuban kids who before were suffering from malnutrition, all of a sudden having decent diets. And you see also the role that the Cuban revolutionaries played in supporting the national liberation movements in Africa. So I was there, it was really impressive. And while I was there, I was freaked out because there were no homeless people. I was coming from San Francisco, there's homeless people everywhere. So, my little broken Spanish, I was trying to ask people, well, where are all the homeless people? And I was assuming that they had been arrested because that's what we do in the United States with homeless people. And this 76-year-old Afro-Cuban guy grabs me by the wrist and starts walking me through the city and points out all of this new housing construction. And he says, well, if people don't have houses, you build houses. And there was a degree to which that was so simple, but genuine, that it made it clear to me that there are particular moments where things can change. And so then I was there for the World Youth Festival at the end, because people know the Cubans are very particular on ceremony. And so there was a closing ceremony, which was sort of a parade of the continents. And our delegation had to leave early, so as we were walking out, I looked up, and about 20 feet away was Fidel. And all of a sudden I started crying. And I realized later on that what it was like you see a particular person. Like there was a small grouping of people who took a risk, who got on a boat and changed history. And I think the question for us is, what are we going to do? Frantz Fanon said that the responsibility of each generation is to find its historical task and to fulfill it. And I think that we're at a particular moment where our task is to build a socialist left organization that's able to transform the world. And I think it's time to do it now. Thanks.